On February 4, 1945, three men sat down in a former imperial palace on the Crimean coast and redrew the map of the world. Franklin Roosevelt was dying, though almost no one in the room said so out loud. Winston Churchill was exhausted, watching an empire he loved slip through his fingers. Joseph Stalin was patient and methodical, and he was holding nearly all the cards, because the Red Army already occupied the ground everyone else was arguing about. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The popular version of what happened next is simple and comforting. Two former allies, bound together only by a common enemy, fell out once that enemy was defeated. Ideology collided with ideology, the story goes, and a nuclear standoff was the inevitable result. It is a tidy explanation. It is also incomplete. The deeper record, the military orders, the private cables, the minutes of meetings not declassified for decades, shows something messier and more human. It shows two nations that had never fully trusted each other making a series of specific, traceable decisions, each one narrowing the room for the next, until the door between them closed. To understand why Yalta mattered so much, you have to understand what each man actually wanted from it, because the three leaders were not negotiating from the same set of assumptions. Roosevelt wanted Soviet participation in the war against Japan, and he wanted Stalin's support for a new international body, the United Nations, that he believed could prevent future wars through collective security rather than competing alliances. Churchill wanted to preserve as much of the British Empire and its influence in the Mediterranean as he could, and he was already privately worried about Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe, more worried than Roosevelt was willing to admit in public. Stalin wanted something narrower and, from his own perspective, entirely defensible. He wanted a buffer. Twice in 30 years, invading armies had crossed the plains of Poland and driven deep into Russian territory, first in the First World War and then again in the Second, when the German invasion killed an estimated 27 million Soviet citizens, soldiers and civilians combined. Stalin was blunt about this at Tehran in late 1943 and again at Yalta 14 months later. Poland, he said, was a matter of Soviet security, not merely Soviet preference, and no Soviet government could survive politically if it allowed a hostile or even a neutral government to sit on that border again. The agreement that emerged from Yalta on this specific point was a study in constructive ambiguity, the kind of diplomatic language that lets two sides sign the same document while meaning two different things by it. The Declaration on Liberated Europe promised free and unfettered elections in the countries Soviet troops had liberated from Nazi occupation, along with the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they would live. It sounded firm on paper. The enforcement mechanism, however, was left almost entirely unspecified, and Soviet forces already controlled the physical ground on which those elections would supposedly take place. Roosevelt's own ambassador to Moscow, Averell Harriman, warned him, before the conference, that Stalin's definition of a friendly government and an American definition of a free one were unlikely to be the same thing, and that the Soviet leader would interpret vague language in whatever way best suited the reality on the ground. Roosevelt accepted the language anyway, calculating that Soviet cooperation on Japan and on the founding of the United Nations was worth the risk. It was a wager, made by a dying president under enormous physical and political pressure, and it would not pay off the way he hoped. What followed at Yalta and at the smaller, less remembered meetings that surrounded it established a pattern that would repeat across 1945 and 1946. Washington and London would propose language emphasizing democratic process and self-determination. Moscow would agree to that language in principle, while treating the territory its army physically held as a settled question in practice. This was not a hidden agenda revealed only later by historians combing through archives. It was visible in real time to the people conducting the negotiations, and it shows up plainly in the cable traffic between the State Department and the American Embassy in Moscow throughout the spring of 1945, much of it declassified in the 1960s and 70s as part of the Foreign Relations of the United States document series. Harriman cabled Washington in April of that year describing what he called a barbarian invasion of Europe, using the phrase not to describe Soviet troops crossing a border, but to describe the imposition of a political system by force, carried out under the cover of diplomatic language that everyone in the room had technically already agreed to. The gap between the promise and the practice was not a secret waiting to be uncovered decades later. It was an open wound at the time, one that the wartime alliance had simply been too useful and too fragile to address directly while the fighting against Germany was still underway. Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, less than 10 weeks after Yalta, before any of these tensions could be resolved, and Harry Truman inherited a relationship with the Soviet Union that he understood far less intimately than his predecessor had. Truman had been vice president for barely 3 months. He had not been briefed on the Manhattan Project, let alone on the private nuances of Roosevelt's personal rapport with Stalin, and he came into the presidency with a blunter, more transactional instinct toward Soviet behavior. 11 days after taking office, Truman met with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov in the Oval Office and delivered a sharp lecture on Poland, telling him, according to multiple accounts including Truman's own memoirs, that agreements needed to be kept, not violated. Molotov is reported to have said he had never been talked to like that in his life, to which Truman replied that if the Soviets kept their agreements, they would not be talked to like that again. The exchange marked a genuine shift in tone from the Roosevelt years, and both governments noticed it immediately. Soviet officials began describing the new administration internally as less flexible and more suspicious than its predecessor, a characterization that shaped how Moscow approached the negotiations that followed for years afterward. The event that hardened the emerging divide more than any single diplomatic exchange was the atomic bomb, and specifically the question of what to do with the knowledge required to build one. The United States detonated the first nuclear device at the Trinity test site in New Mexico on July 16, 1945, 3 days before the Potsdam Conference began outside Berlin. Truman informed Stalin at Potsdam that the United States possessed a weapon of unusual destructive force, deliberately avoiding the words atomic or nuclear in front of the wider group. Stalin's reaction, by every American account from inside the room, was muted, almost indifferent, and Truman came away believing the Soviet leader had not grasped the significance of what he had been told. What the Americans did not know, and would not learn until decades later when Soviet intelligence archives became partially accessible after 1991, was that Stalin already knew a great deal about the Manhattan Project through espionage, including material passed by Klaus Fuchs, a physicist working inside both the American and British bomb programs. Stalin's calm at Potsdam was not naivety. It was the composure of a man who had already been briefed by his own intelligence services. Within days of returning to Moscow, Stalin ordered a dramatic acceleration of the Soviet atomic program under the secret police chief Lavrenti Beria, and the Soviet Union detonated its own device 4 years later, in August of 1949, far sooner than nearly every American intelligence estimate of the period had predicted. The nuclear monopoly that American planners had assumed would give them years of diplomatic leverage evaporated much faster than Washington expected, and the discovery that the monopoly had been undermined by espionage from within the American and British programs poisoned the political atmosphere of the following years in ways that extended well beyond foreign policy, feeding directly into the domestic anti-communist politics that would come to define the next decade of American life. The economic and territorial questions inside occupied Germany proved just as combustible as the atomic ones, and arguably more consequential for the shape the Cold War actually took. Germany had been divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet, with a similarly divided city of Berlin sitting deep inside the Soviet zone, an island of joint occupation more than 100 miles from the nearest Western-controlled territory. The Yalta and Potsdam agreements called for Germany to be treated as a single economic unit, but reparations policy split the wartime allies almost immediately. The Soviet Union, having suffered catastrophic industrial destruction across its western territories, wanted extensive reparations extracted directly from German industrial capacity, and Soviet occupation authorities began dismantling entire factories and shipping the equipment eastward on a large scale, sometimes down to the wiring in the walls. American planners, increasingly worried about the economic and political stability of Western Europe as a whole, moved in the opposite direction, arguing that a punitive approach to Germany risked recreating the economic collapse that had helped produce Nazism in the first place. This was not an abstract disagreement conducted in position papers. It played out in concrete, dated administrative decisions with immediate consequences. In May of 1946, General Lucius Clay, the American military governor in Germany, halted reparations shipments from the American zone to the Soviet Union, citing Moscow's failure to provide the economic data on its own zone that the Potsdam Agreement required. It was, in effect, an economic ultimatum delivered through the mechanism of an occupation government's paperwork, and Soviet authorities recognized it immediately as a rupture, not as a bureaucratic technicality. The following year, this economic divergence hardened into declared policy. In June of 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall announced what would become known as the Marshall Plan, an offer of American economic assistance to help rebuild European economies, extended explicitly to the Soviet Union and its Eastern European sphere, as well as to the countries of Western Europe. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov attended the initial planning conference in Paris that July with a large delegation of economic advisors, then abruptly withdrew after several days, and instructed the Eastern European governments already under Soviet influence to refuse participation as well, reversing an earlier, more open Czechoslovak and Polish interest in the program. The internal Soviet reasoning, laid out in cables between Molotov and Stalin that were released from Russian archives only after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, framed American aid as a mechanism for extending Washington's economic and political control over the continent, generosity with strings that would eventually bind the recipient nations to American markets and American priorities. Whether or not that reading was accurate, and American planners genuinely did see a stable, prosperous Western Europe as a bulwark against communist political parties gaining power through the ballot box in countries like France and Italy, the Soviet refusal meant European recovery would proceed along two separate and increasingly incompatible economic tracks. The continent was being split, decision by decision, months before anyone had drawn a formal line across a map. Before either of those crises, the first real test of the wartime alliance's survival had already played out far from Europe, in northern Iran. Soviet, British, and American troops had jointly occupied Iran during the war to secure a supply corridor for American aid heading to the Soviet Union and to keep Iranian oil out of German hands. All three powers had agreed, in a formal treaty signed in 1942, to withdraw their forces within 6 months of the war's end. British and American troops did leave on schedule. Soviet forces did not. Instead, across the winter of 1945 and into 1946, Soviet authorities backed the creation of two nominally independent, Soviet-aligned republics in Iranian Azerbaijan and Kurdistan, and Soviet troop movements inside Iran appeared, to American and British observers, to be preparing for a longer-term presence rather than a withdrawal. Iran brought the matter before the newly formed United Nations Security Council in January of 1946, the first serious test of the very organization Roosevelt had wanted so badly, and Truman applied direct and, according to Soviet records released decades later, genuinely effective diplomatic pressure, reportedly warning Moscow through diplomatic channels that continued occupation would carry serious consequences. Soviet forces withdrew from Iran by May of 1946, and the Soviet-backed republics collapsed within months once Iranian government forces moved back into the north. The crisis is rarely given the same weight in popular retellings as Yalta or the Berlin blockade, but American officials at the time treated it as genuinely formative, an early and, from Washington's perspective, successful demonstration that firm public pressure could reverse Soviet territorial ambitions, a lesson that shaped how the same officials would approach Greece, Turkey, and Berlin in the years that immediately followed. That underlying tension broke into open crisis again in February of 1948, when communist parties in Czechoslovakia, backed by Soviet pressure and by the presence of Soviet troops just across the border, forced the resignation of the country's non-communist ministers and consolidated full political control in what came to be called the Czechoslovak coup. Czechoslovakia had been, until that point, the one country in Eastern Europe that still maintained a functioning multi-party government and close ties to the West, and its sudden absorption into the Soviet sphere shocked policymakers in Washington and London, several of whom drew an explicit comparison to Hitler's annexation of the same country a decade earlier. The coup accelerated congressional support for the Marshall Plan, which had been moving slowly through Congress until that point, and it hardened American assumptions about Soviet intentions across the whole of Eastern Europe. That same underlying tension over Germany produced its most visible and dangerous confrontation just a few months later, in the form of a currency. In June of 1948, the American, British, and French occupation authorities introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, into their combined Western zones, without coordinating the move with Soviet authorities beforehand. The stated purpose was straightforward economic stabilization, replacing a wartime currency so devalued that cigarettes and coffee had become more reliable mediums of exchange than the old Reichsmark in daily transactions. Soviet authorities viewed the currency reform as a unilateral move toward the permanent economic and political separation of a West German state, and their response was immediate. On June 24, 1948, Soviet forces cut off all road, rail, and canal access between the western zones of Germany and West Berlin, which sat entirely inside Soviet-controlled territory. 2 million people in the western sectors of the city were left without direct access to food, coal, or medicine from the west. The United States and Britain responded not with troops on the ground, which would very likely have meant open war, but with airplanes. The Berlin airlift ran for nearly 11 months, more than 270,000 individual flights delivering food and fuel around the clock in all weather, and it succeeded. Stalin lifted the blockade in May of 1949, having gained nothing militarily, and having handed the Western Allies one of the defining propaganda victories of the entire conflict. Within months, two separate German states were formally established, the Federal Republic in the West and the Democratic Republic in the East, and the division that had been building through reparations disputes and currency decisions for 3 straight years was now written permanently into the map itself. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. By the time the Berlin blockade ended, the intellectual architecture for a permanent American strategy toward the Soviet Union was already in place, and it had arrived from an unexpected source inside the American diplomatic bureaucracy itself. In February of 1946, George Kennan, a mid-level American diplomat stationed in Moscow, sent an 8,000-word cable back to Washington in response to a routine Treasury Department question about why the Soviet Union was declining to support the newly formed International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Kennan's answer went far beyond the narrow question he had been asked. He argued that Soviet hostility toward the West was rooted not primarily in genuine grievance, and not in Marxist ideology alone, but in the internal political needs of the Soviet regime itself, which required an external enemy to justify its own authoritarian control at home. Soviet expansionism, Kennan wrote, would keep probing for weakness wherever it found soft spots in the Western position, but it was not a suicidal or irrational force driven by an unstoppable timetable, and it could be contained through patient, firm, and vigilant resistance rather than through appeasement on one hand or preventive war on the other. The cable, expanded into an anonymous article published the following year in the journal Foreign Affairs under the byline X, became the intellectual foundation for the doctrine of containment, the strategic framework that would guide American policy toward the Soviet Union for the next 4 decades of the 20th century. Kennan's cable was not the only widely noted statement of the period to frame the emerging divide in stark terms. On March 5, 1946, less than a month later, Winston Churchill, by then out of office and touring the United States as a private citizen, delivered a speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, with Truman sitting on the stage beside him. Churchill declared that an iron curtain had descended across the continent, from Stettin on the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic, behind which the historic capitals of Central and Eastern Europe now lay in what he called the Soviet sphere, subject to increasing measures of control from Moscow. The speech caused an immediate uproar. Stalin denounced it within days as a call to war against the Soviet Union, comparing Churchill directly to Hitler, and a number of American newspapers and politicians, including several Democratic senators, criticized Truman for appearing to endorse such openly confrontational language from a foreign statesman on American soil, at a moment when the wartime alliance was still officially intact and popular with much of the American public. Truman's own aides later insisted the president had not seen an advance copy of the speech and was surprised by its bluntness, though he had personally invited Churchill to speak and had introduced him to the audience that day. Whatever the precise truth of that private disagreement, Fulton mattered less as a cause of the coming rift than as a public naming of a division that officials in both Washington and Moscow already understood privately to be underway, articulated in language blunt enough that ordinary readers of a morning newspaper, rather than only diplomats reading classified cables, could suddenly see the shape of what was forming. Containment was not merely an abstract idea confined to journals and internal memoranda. It was operationalized almost immediately, in response to a specific and fairly narrow crisis. In early 1947, Britain informed the United States that it could no longer afford to continue providing military and economic support to the governments of Greece and Turkey, both of which faced internal insurgency or external pressure that Washington read as Soviet-backed, even though Stalin had in fact privately discouraged the Greek communist insurgents from expecting Soviet support, a detail that only emerged from Soviet archives decades afterward. On March 12, 1947, Truman addressed a joint session of Congress and requested $400 million in aid, framing the request in sweeping, near-universal terms that became known as the Truman Doctrine, describing it as the policy of the United States to support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure, anywhere in the world. It was a doctrine written to justify a single narrow funding request for 2 specific countries, and it expanded almost overnight into a global commitment that would be invoked, reinterpreted, and stretched by every American administration for the following 4 decades. 2 years later, in April of 1949, 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington, creating a formal peacetime military alliance, NATO, built on the principle that an armed attack against one member would be treated as an attack against all. The Soviet Union responded, though not for another 6 years, with its own formal alliance structure, the Warsaw Pact, signed in May of 1955, largely in direct reaction to the decision that same month to allow a rearmed West Germany to join NATO. What had started as a series of separate, situational responses to specific and distinct crises in Poland, Germany, Czechoslovakia, Greece, and Turkey had, within roughly a decade, calcified into two permanent, opposing military blocs spanning most of the globe. The confrontation crossed from Europe into Asia in June of 1950, when North Korean forces, with Stalin's reluctant final approval after repeated requests from the North Korean leader Kim Il-sung, crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. Newly available Soviet archival material shows that Stalin had refused to authorize the invasion on several earlier occasions throughout 1949, worried specifically about drawing the United States into direct conflict, and only relented in the spring of 1950 after concluding, based partly on a public speech by Secretary of State Dean Acheson that appeared to exclude Korea from the American defensive perimeter in the Pacific, that Washington was unlikely to intervene. That judgment turned out to be wrong. Truman committed American forces within days, acting under a United Nations resolution that passed only because the Soviet delegate was boycotting the Security Council at the time over an unrelated dispute regarding the representation of China, and was therefore not present to cast a veto. The Korean War that followed killed an estimated 2.5 to 3 million people before ending in an armistice in July of 1953, restoring almost exactly the pre-war border, and it transformed containment from a European policy of economic and diplomatic pressure into a global military commitment, complete with a permanently enlarged American defense budget that the authors of the period's key strategy document had been quietly hoping to secure all along. That document, a National Security Council paper known as NSC 68, had been completed in April of 1950, 2 months before the Korean War began, and it argued for a massive, multi-year increase in American military spending to counter what it described as a fanatical Soviet drive for absolute power over the entire world. The paper's own principal author, Paul Nitze, and Secretary of State Dean Acheson both later acknowledged, in memoirs and interviews given years afterward, that the document had been written in deliberately alarming language, in Acheson's own phrase, language clearer than truth, precisely because its authors believed a more measured or qualified assessment would fail to persuade a war-weary American public and a fiscally cautious Congress to accept the scale of peacetime military spending the authors believed was strategically necessary. The outbreak of the Korean War 6 weeks after the paper was completed handed its authors exactly the crisis they needed to secure its adoption, and American defense spending roughly tripled between 1950 and 1953, establishing a baseline of permanent, large-scale military expenditure that would persist for the rest of the Cold War and beyond. The admission that these early Cold War years were shaped as much by miscalculation, domestic politics, and institutional momentum as by any single coherent grand design did not arrive as a single dramatic confession from either government. It came slowly, in pieces, largely after 1991, when the collapse of the Soviet Union opened its internal archives to outside researchers for the first time in the Union's history. Soviet Politburo records, party correspondence, and the personal notes of Soviet officials revealed a leadership that was, through the late 1940s, considerably more reactive and less confident than most Western intelligence assessments of the period had assumed. The historian Vladislav Zubak, working extensively with these newly opened materials during the 1990s, argued that Stalin's post-war behavior was driven less by a fixed ideological blueprint aimed at global revolution and more by a deeply personal, almost paranoid preoccupation with security, betrayal, and the historical memory of invasion, filtered through the specific and often erratic judgment of one aging dictator and the men around him who were too frightened of him to offer contradicting advice. On the American side, the same declassified NSC and State Department documents that revealed the deliberate rhetorical exaggeration in NSC 68 also showed American planners repeatedly debating, in private, whether their public statements about the scale and coherence of the Soviet threat matched their own internal intelligence assessments, and concluding, more than once, that the gap between the two was politically necessary. Neither set of revelations supports a story of hidden villains secretly engineering a global conflict for private profit or institutional gain behind a curtain of official secrecy. Both point to something more ordinary, and in its way more troubling. Two governments that consistently misread each other's intentions, that each held genuine and often legitimate security concerns, and that each built institutions, doctrines, and political incentives whose internal logic made de-escalation progressively harder with every year that passed. This is also where the historiography itself becomes part of the story, because historians have not actually agreed on a single true origin of the Cold War, whatever a video title might promise. In the 1950s and early 1960s, what is generally called the Orthodox school placed the primary responsibility on Soviet expansionism and ideological aggression, largely accepting the American government's own contemporary framing. Beginning in the mid-1960s, a revisionist school, drawing on figures like William Appleman Williams, reversed much of that emphasis, arguing that American economic interests and a drive to secure open markets for American goods and capital played the decisive role in provoking Soviet defensiveness, particularly around the Marshall Plan and the reconstruction of a capitalist Western Europe. By the 1970s and 80s, a post-revisionist synthesis associated with historians, such as John Lewis Gaddis, attempted to move past a simple assignment of blame altogether, emphasizing instead the structural condition of two powers filling the vacuum left by a collapsed European order, each acting on genuine, if sometimes exaggerated, threat perceptions, rather than on a coherent plan for domination in either capital. The opening of the Soviet archives after 1991 shifted the debate again, giving substantial new support to arguments that Stalin's personal psychology and the internal requirements of his regime mattered enormously, while also complicating any simple picture of Washington as a purely defensive, reactive power, given how consistently American officials chose the more alarming interpretation of ambiguous Soviet behavior when a less alarming one was also available. What most professional historians actually get wrong, if anything, is not a missing secret. It is the tendency, in the version of this history that reaches a general audience, to compress 4 decades of contested, revised, and re-revised scholarly argument into a single clean verdict, when the honest state of the field is a real and continuing disagreement among serious researchers working from the same declassified record. A textbook chapter has room for 1 paragraph on causation. A university seminar can spend an entire semester on the Yalta Declaration alone and still leave students arguing. The popular history video, including this one, sits somewhere between those two, compressing a genuinely unresolved scholarly debate into something that can be told in half an hour. And the honest thing to say is that compression itself, not any hidden document, is where most of the distortion in the popular version actually comes from. The long consequence of the specific dated decisions traced through all of this, the ambiguous language at Yalta, the halted reparations shipments, the currency reform in Germany, the long telegram, a doctrine written to fund 2 countries and applied to the entire world, a strategy paper deliberately written in language clearer than the truth, is a set of institutions and habits of mind that outlasted the conflict that produced them by decades. NATO, created to answer a crisis in 1949, added new members and expanded its stated mission for years after the Warsaw Pact it was built to counter had formally dissolved in 1991. The division of Germany, understood by nearly everyone involved in 1945 to be a temporary wartime expedient, lasted 45 years and shaped the economic and political development of an entire continent across 2 full generations. The habit of viewing distant regional conflicts through the lens of a single global ideological struggle, established during the Truman Doctrine debates over Greece and Turkey, extended American military and political involvement into Korea, into Vietnam, into Central America, and into a long list of smaller interventions whose local causes were often only loosely connected to the original Soviet-American rivalry that supplied their official justification. Historians continue to disagree, sometimes sharply, about how much weight to place on each side of the ledger, about whether the Cold War was structurally close to inevitable, given the collision of a security-obsessed authoritarian state with a newly dominant global power, or whether specific, identifiable choices at specific moments, a different reparations policy, a more coordinated approach to German currency reform, a public rhetoric around containment closer to the private intelligence assessments that informed it, might have produced a less rigid and less dangerous decades-long standoff. What the documentary record does not support on either side of that ongoing scholarly debate is the idea of a single hidden hand, a suppressed transaction, or a secret deal that explains what 4 decades of open, extensively documented, and often simply clumsy human decision-making already explains reasonably well on its own. The Cold War did not begin with a conspiracy uncovered decades later. It began in full view, in memos and speeches and airlifted crates of coal, made by named officials who mostly said afterward, in their own memoirs, exactly what they had been thinking at the time. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.